Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and you may or may not know that I have a very intense, lifelong love of Victorian literature that started when I was just a kid. And so, as such, one of my favorite events of the entire reading year on BookTube is Victober, which is the month of October, and we focus on reading Victorian literature. This is a readathon that happens every year, so I'll link the co-host down below so that way you can check out their channels, their announcements, the prompts and stuff that they have for Victober. But I wanted to talk to some of you who maybe you already had a lot of reading plans, or maybe you're really intimidated by Victorian literature, and when you think of Victorian literature, you think of David Copperfield or Middlemarch and these massive, huge Victorian books that are really intimidating. So I thought it would be really fun to come up with a list of 10 Victorian books that are under 300 pages. Way less intimidating, a good way to dip your toe in if you're less familiar with Victorian literature, or maybe you're reading the group read this year, which is super, super long, a huge Anthony Trollope book, and you want to read some other Victorian literature other than the group read, but you don't know where you're going to squeeze it in. That's where this list comes in. Hopefully it's helpful to you with some classics that maybe you didn't know were this short, or maybe you haven't even heard of before. The first book I'm going to mention clocks in at 234 pages in my edition, and that is Agnes Gray by Anne Bronte. Anne Bronte is one of the famous Bronte sisters. You may think of Emily Bronte for Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre for Charlotte Bronte, but Anne Bronte also wrote several novels. This is the shorter one of the ones that she wrote. This is actually one that I have not yet read, and I am reading for Victober this year with my Patreon. Super excited to read this one. My understanding is that it's about a girl who is the daughter of a clergyman, and she falls on hard times and is required to get a job as a governess. And I think that maybe the children she's governess to are not the best. I think that's my understanding, but this is a really great option, especially if you're looking for a woman author. Next up, coming in at 185 pages in my edition, is Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. It's hilarious to me that his first and last name are the same. Feels like some mean parents there. Anyways, this is like a funny story about three guys and a dog who I think go on some sort of journey in a boat. And this is another one that I actually have not yet read, but am reading during the month of October this year. Next up, if you're looking for something a little darker, a bit more maybe gothic in feel, coming in at 279 pages is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I read this a couple of years ago for Victober, and it has stuck with me. It was one of my favorite books of the year that year, and it packs a punch, let me just tell you. It's very dark, has a lot of very unlikable characters, and it's about a young man who basically wants to live a hedonistic lifestyle, but there is a price to pay for that. Highly recommend this one. An author who's known for some pretty depressing works that are also some lengthy works is Thomas Hardy, and like I said, a lot of his books are on the longer side, but one of his books that in my edition clocks in at 273 pages is Under the Greenwood Tree, and it's my understanding that this is a less depressing work of his. But again, this is another one that I have not yet read that's been sitting on my shelves that I hope to get to in the month of October. If you're wanting something a bit more of a novella length that is also relatively dark, clocking in at 92 pages, is The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I actually have read this one, as you might be able to tell by all my little tabs. I read this with my Patreon earlier this year, and my goodness, Conrad has lush prose that you just sink into. This does have some really heavy topics about colonization, about slavery, about ivory trade, all of that kind of stuff. So there's some very interesting conversations to be had with this short story, and it's definitely not an easy or a fun read, but a great option if you're looking for something on the shorter side. I also want to say a lot of people were required to read this in high school or college, and I feel like this is a book that is probably better understood and enjoyed, better conversations to be facilitated as an adult. So if you read this when you were younger and you're like, oh my gosh, I hate this, you may want to give it another try as an adult. Next up is one of my childhood favorites. My edition comes in at 203 pages, and that is Silas Marner by George Eliot. George Eliot was actually a female author who wrote under a male pen name. And when you think of George Eliot, if you're aware of her, you probably think of Middlemarch or The Mill on the Floss, which are both very, very long books. Silas Marner is one of her shorter ones. And this is actually the book that kicked off my love of Victorian literature, because my dad read this aloud to me when I was about 10 and absolutely love it. We still reference it all the time and think about it all the time, our whole family. And so this is one that I really recommend. It's about a very miserly hermit who lives alone and only sees value in his hidden gold that he has, and then comes to see value in other things. It's really, really wonderful. A Victorian classic you're probably very familiar with, maybe you're not aware, is Victorian and has a lot of influence in our pop culture, but maybe you haven't read the original, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. My edition clocks in at 197 pages, so it's under 200 pages. And this book is fantastic. I did not read it until I was an adult, but obviously we have all of this stuff in our society of like monster stories and Frankenstein is referenced all the time. And so if you have not read the original story, be aware that it's very gothic, it's very dark, it explores, man's godlike complex, it explores what it means to be human, what it means to be loved, and all of those kinds of things, and it explores revenge. It is just chef's kiss, like perfection. And honestly, what better Victorian novel to read during the month of October leading up to Halloween also. It's perfectly atmospheric for October. Maybe you're looking for something a little lighter, a little more nostalgic, a little more fun, in which case I would recommend Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. I love this book. Again, one I didn't read till I was an adult. I think it was probably written for children, but I think it's really enjoyable for adults, especially because there's so much in here that feels so nostalgic, even if you haven't read it before, because our society has taken so much of what we consider almost canon for pirates and swashbuckling tales. I mean, the whole pirate with a peg leg and a parrot and an eye patch over his eye. It's like Robert Louis Stevenson did all of that, and there's so much that's like original to him that he popularized and is now like almost like how we stereotypically see pirates. And so that makes this story extra, extra fun, and I absolutely love it. It's a bit more of a summer read, I think, because you've got high seas and it just feels warmer and more tropical. But hey, I think that there's never a bad time to read Treasure Island. If you're looking for some sci-fi, might I steer you in the direction of H.G. Wells. This is The Time Machine and The Invisible Man, has both of them in there. The Time Machine's about 80 pages, Invisible Man's about 140. Both of them are classic sci-fi tales from the Victorian era. H.G. Wells also wrote War of the Worlds, which I don't own, so I'm actually not sure how long that one is. That might also fit into this list, but it's really fun for me to read sci-fi written in the Victorian era of what they thought the future might look like, what they think that we might be capable of in the future technologically. I always find that super fascinating. And so either one of these is a really good fit if you're looking to try something a little bit outside the box of what you might consider Victorian literature, because what comes to mind, like I said, is often Charles Dickens or something like that that's examining class and examining society. But the fun thing about Victorian literature is that there are all genres. There are mysteries, there's more slice of life, there's more social activism type books, there's sci-fi, there's horror. Frankenstein probably more falls in that line. And so there's so many different options to choose from. So if you're like, I don't like Victorian literature, have you tried Victorian sci-fi? Maybe you would like that. The last book I want to mention is a bit more on the cozy side. This one is under 200 pages, 180 pages in my edition, and that's The Warden by Anthony Trollope. I actually read this last year for Victober, and it is such a cozy feel. There are some infuriating characters for sure, but there's some very, very lovable characters, in particular the main character, the warden. It's about this man who, as part of the church, has been established as a warden over this infirmary, and word gets out that maybe he's getting paid a little bit more than he should, and so there's kind of this movement against him to remove him and take the money, the excess money that's being given to him, and give it to the people who live there. And it blows up into this big thing, and it's really interesting. There's a lot of church politics in it that I wasn't as familiar with, but it still wasn't difficult to follow or anything like that. And Mr. Harding, the warden, is such a dear, and I love him so much. And if you really enjoy this book, this is the first in a series that Trollope wrote, the Barsetshire Chronicles, which I've only continued on to book 2 so far, but this is the first of a series. But if you stop here and you don't continue on, this story is still enough of a closed loop that it doesn't end on this cliffhanger where you're like, oh my gosh, I have to read the next book. But if you enjoy it, there is more. Well, there you have it. There are 10 shorter Victorian classics. A lot of these are actually under 200 pages, but for sure every single one of them is under 300 pages. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below. Have you read any of these? Do you have any other shorter Victorian works that you can recommend if someone is maybe intimidated by the length of Victorian classics, or maybe they want to squeeze in some more Victorian reading during Victober, but they don't want something huge? I would love to hear your recommendations of shorter Victorian books that you have enjoyed in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.